to the courage to be courageous.
So, James, tell me a little bit about your history, where you were raised, and also your connection when you became religious of the same denomination I did as Jehovah's Witness. So tell us a little bit about that history.
I grew up in Rhode Island. My parents had their issues and were divorced when I was quite young. My mother found someone else and remarried, and it was at that time that the Jehovah's Witnesses came to her door, and I think I don't know, might have been mentally ill at the time, but she seemed to like their message. I think there was this kind of the Jehovah's Witnesses make everything black and white. And I think that in some ways, for some people, makes life a little easier because there's no gray area. And that gray area in life for many people can be very challenging. So my sister and I, we were brought up as Jehovah's Witnesses and had to attend all the meetings and be part of that organization. I think as a child, you kind of go along with what your parents are doing, and you want the approval of your parents, so you kind of you're on their program, and and I think we went along with it for many years. I think as a teenager, perhaps I might have started to have my doubts and my inklings of perhaps there's another way of living that might be better for me. So I think part of me kind of went along with it, knowing that at some point I'd be able to leave home and kind of create my own life.
So how old were you when your mother became a Jehovah's Witness? You started attending meetings. How old were you then, James?
Probably 7 or 8 years old.
Did you have an inclination at that time that you were different or gay?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when I was very, very young, I knew that I was different. I think when you're a child, you don't necessarily understand what that is, but it was, I would decorate my sister's dollhouses. I was more interested in the decoration, of our houses than I was in playing sports. And, I loved clothes and dressing up and all of that. And, I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone if, that they thought that I actually might be gay. And even then, I'm not sure you really sort of understand that fully. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and at that time, there wasn't really a lot of talk about it. And everything was still, very closeted. And, growing up with the Jehovah's Witnesses, it was all very, taboo and kind of like, they didn't even want you to masturbate. And everything was a sin. And so, yeah, it was a very strange place to be, as a child and sort of developing these feelings, but not really sort of understanding or knowing what to do with them, but just, being taught that those things were bad.
So what happened then when you were 7 and you continued being one of Jehovah's Witnesses as a child, going from door to door, preaching with your parents? How long did you do that before you decided that you could not do this anymore?
I probably until I was like maybe 16 or 17, I started to, working part-time jobs, which gave me an excuse to not go to the meetings. So I started skipping meetings. I didn't go door to door as much, and I gave up a lot of what was, you were typically, supposed to be doing as a Jehovah's Witness.
So now your mother remarried. Did she? And she did not marry a witness, did she?
She did indeed. Which was kind of a nightmare scenario. He was very abusive, emotionally, especially toward his own children as well. He was physically abusive. He was very unhappy about my mother becoming a Jehovah's Witness, and that created, I think, more problems for them. But I think that he despised me, I think, for being gay. His children came to live with us for a while, and and his son, called me a faggot or whatever, and I was complaining. And he said, well, go put the boxing gloves on and prove that you're not. It was that kind of thing.
So how did he know you were gay? Did he just make a summary? Did he just assume you were?
I think it was obvious.
Okay.
Obvious that I was different, which, probably meant gay. My mother was very indulgent. But then when she married him, he thought that we were spoiled. And my mother indulged me and would buy me whatever clothes I wanted to wear for school and that type of thing. But with him, he kind of like, it was like we were living in poverty and there was no money for anything, even though my father was supporting my sister and I. He would allow me like 2 pairs of pants and 2 shirts from like the dollar store or, something like that, which, to me, who had such an interest in style, it was, debilitating. That lasted until I was maybe 14, and then I got a job, and then I sort of had the money to do what I wanted to do. And it was a radical change in my life because I sort of became the person I was and had the opportunity to be, and and then dressed to be that person. And it was like a transformation on so many levels for me of sort of perhaps that was the start of getting in touch with myself in my own life and determining what that would be. And my grades in school, I went from being like a C student to a straight A student, and didn't have any problems being bullied or anything else like that in school anymore. And that gave me a lot of self-confidence. I think there were still some issues with, the Jehovah's Witness, and some of their tactics to sort of keep you in line are trying to shame you and use that shame as a weapon to get you to conform. And it could really leave you feeling sort of worthless because you could never live up to all their standards and rules and regulations. And especially being gay, which is a natural thing, but they're taught that that is something that if you are gay, then you're going to be destroyed, and you're a terrible sinner, and all that kind of like fire and brimstone kind of thing, which scared me, I think, to a certain point, because I felt like a failure whenever I had sort of improper thoughts, or if I was masturbating, or whatever. It was like you were committing these horrible sins.
And shame comes from different aspects, but religion and Jehovah's Witnesses use an incredible amount of shame.
Probably one of the cult techniques, right, to keep people in line.
Control and shame. Now you're 16, 17. Now, are you out on your own yet, or are you still living with your parents?
I didn't move out till I was about 18. At that point, I was kind of getting away from the witnesses, but it was kind of like my mother wanted me out of the house because, she had her own issues with her own marriage. And I think, aside from being a Jehovah's Witness, she wasn't a very good mother, and she was very self-absorbed and didn't really care that, if that, it was challenging for me to then, figure out, get a job, find a place to live, all of that. And, she wouldn't support my going to college. Because obviously, as you know, the Jehovah's Witnesses think the world's going to end, so why would you go to college?
Yes, I went through that same thing.
So you kind of are, your possibilities become more limited in what you can do for work. Eventually, something came my way, and in an apartment that was affordable came my way, and I was very, very relieved because, at times I thought, that I literally might be homeless. And then, that was a great thing because I was finally on my own, and I could really start to create the life that I wanted to create for myself, but still, you know, somewhat sort of, I think there's a phrase that people use now, which I can't think of. It's like there's 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the witnesses.
Yes, yes.
For so many people, when you leave the witnesses, it's your whole world, and it's everything that you know, and you're going out into the complete unknown. And for some people, that's just too scary, so they never make that kind of move, right? But I was kind of somewhere in between, where I was starting to make friends, out in the world, and yet still had some connection, although less, with the witnesses. And that was something that sort of happened gradually. I didn't have sex with anyone until I was 19. So, I was probably almost a year on my own before anything happened, because I was still, so nervous and scared, and, probably a little traumatized by the witnesses.
How did you finally come to a complete break from Jehovah's Witnesses? How did that? I know it's an event. You have to go through different events to get there. But was there a time that you felt, I finally am completely disconnected from being a Jehovah's Witnesses? And I have to believe when you did, if that happened, well, I'm sure it happened, you had to get a sense of peace and release at that time.
One thing that happened is that, while I was living on my own, I had met someone who was a bit older than I was. He was a professor at Brown University. And I think when you're young and you're quite stupid and you fall in love immediately, and I had fallen for this guy for some reason. And, I think he was just interested in having a fling. And, when we finally, had sex, and that was it was done. So I was devastated and heartbroken, and started to think, well, maybe the witnesses were right, that these people are just going to hurt you, and you're going to be left alone, and whatever sort of stories that sort of like you were told, to try and keep you scared to stay within, the truth, right?
Right.
That sort of scared me back to the Jehovah's Witnesses for a little while. And then it was finally, I moved to the next town over. And I think at that point, I was truly able to separate myself from the witnesses, and there were no more meetings and no more door to door or nothing. And really, that's when, my life, sort of out in the world, began. And, to realize that, there are good people, and, there are bad people within the witnesses as well. It was interesting because, I realized that, I met some people that became, more to me than even my own flesh and blood. There was sort of, a whole new world to explore, and possibilities, and everything else. And I think that you realize that sort of like there is the opportunity or the possibility of love, romance, friendships, everything outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
And so you finally disconnected from them totally at when you were what, 19, 20?
Probably 1920, yeah.
Okay. And then tell me how your life took off from there. Now you're no longer a JW, and now you're moving forward. And tell me a little bit of process of how your life went from there.
So I think that there was like, you realize that sort of like you didn't have to settle for just any job to get you through and to make enough money so that you could, be a pioneer or whatever, and that you can spend, 75% of your time doing things connected with the witnesses. And,
Right.
Instead I focused on my career. I was working at a bank, and I worked my way up to being an assistant trader of gold and silver. So I was, living a good life. I was making money. I was traveling. I was doing the things that I wanted to do. And I think you're young. You're thinking about, going out to dinner and dressing nicely, and enjoying sort of what you think are the finer things in life. And, maybe in some ways too, making up for lost time, because of, being under such, rules and regulations under the Jehovah's Witnesses. And all of a sudden you're presented with all this freedom to just be. There's a whole world to explore. And I think that, part of it is sifting through all of that and, having, life's experiences.
Now tell me how you got connected to the design business. I think this is a really interesting story, and tell us how that happened.
It's kind of like, I think there's a saying that sometimes opportunity comes disguised as a problem. At the time, I was fascinated with, the world of Ralph Lauren. I was shopped there. I was buying all my clothes there. And the store manager said, well, you have all the clothes. You should work here. And, I said, well, is that a job offer? He's like, I'd hire you in a second. So, I wasn't really happy with banking, and I thought this might be an interesting change. So I took advantage of that offer, which was a challenging adjustment. But what happened is I became one of their top salespeople, and they invited me to go and work at one of their stores in Long Island in home furnishings, because typically men that worked in home furnishings did very well. I always liked the idea of being closer to New York. So I said, what the hell, it'll be an adventure. And it was kind of a great gift because it was an instant connection with something that I think was innate, because, all of a sudden I'm putting rooms together for people, because Ralph Lauren made sofas and chairs and fabrics and wall coverings. And it was like, you're sort of acting as an interior designer, even though I had no background in it. It was a natural thing for me to put these rooms together for people. People would say, oh, can you help me with my living room or something like that? And at first I said, no, but I guess, well, if I can help you in the store, I guess I can help you, on my day off. And then some friends some clients that were designers kind of took me under their wing and helped me along. And I started to get clients. And even as I was promoted within Ralph Lauren, I was still decorating on the side. And I realized that I was making more money on my day off than I was there for a week. And I said, well, if I get one more job, I'm out of here. And that afternoon, I was presented with a project. So I quit, started my own business, which was instantly successful. There was a time when, working at Ralph Lauren carried a lot of weight, and, people wouldn't even ask for a portfolio. It just, the fact that I worked at Ralph Lauren was enough for them. And that lasted for years and years and years. And then eventually I became friendly with a man named Albert Hadley. He was a partner in the firm called Parrish Hadley, that was a prestigious New York design firm. they were known for clients like Rockefellers and Gettys and Astors and that type of thing. And he asked me to join the firm, and I thought, it would be like the design equivalent of going to Harvard Business School. So
Yes.
I did that for like a year and a half, but I realized that, it was too big of a pay cut. And so I was getting these large projects offered to me and realized it's silly of me to give most of the profits to the company when I got the projects on my own. And, my bookkeeper, thought I was insane and suggested that I just start my own business, which I did, and which I've been doing ever since, probably about over 30 years.
Yeah.
James Andrew, interiordesign.com. There's shots of my apartment and many other, projects, but everyone has their own sensibility. So what I do is very diverse. It depends on the client and what they want.
Now, you've had a successful career. You've come from a religious background, as you and I were the same religion, Jehovah's Witnesses, and we were able to break from that, get out of the organization. Not that there's not many fine people that are Jehovah's Witnesses. It's like any religion. There's good in all religions, but there's also policies of religion that are destructive to not only the LGBT community, but even the heterosexual community. But you've progressed through that, and I've progressed through that. So where are you with your life today as you've got a successful career, you have a beautiful man in your life, Scott?
For a while, I'm not sure if your experience was the same, but I think that the Jehovah's Witnesses really sort of turned me away from God, away from anything that felt remotely religious. But I realized, or was introduced to, that one could be spiritual, which has nothing to do with religion, but has more to do with realizing, how much power we have, the power of positive thinking, and that we really do have the power to create our own reality. And I think that has been, messianic in my life as far as creating the kind of life that I want for myself. Because, when one works for oneself, it can be a bit of a roller coaster. And I've had, high highs and low lows. And, sometimes, those low lows are very difficult to get through. But, if we can sort of improve our outlook and our frame of mind and be aware of our thinking, we can sometimes shift the story that we're telling in our heads to something more empowering and more positive, which typically attracts better results.
That's what we all want to do, be at peace with ourselves, be our authentic selves. And I think when we're at peace with ourselves, then we're going to be more at peace with other people.
Absolutely. I think it's a process of realizing, our self-worth. And, part of that is self-love, and part of it is also believing that we are more than enough. And I think that sense of feeling worthy is everything, because I think that everything else tends to hold us behind in life and interferes with, loving and being loved and everything else in our lives. So it took a while to come to that. And it was a process as well. And sometimes I think I had, learned my lesson and realized that there were many more to learn. And, I guess we'll be learning until we die, hopefully.
You've made some really good comments there, and I really appreciate that. But I want to touch on this because I'm so encouraged, and I mentioned to James if it was okay for me to talk about that. James, I know you're living with stage 4 cancer, and that has got to be heartbreaking, and yet there's some hope to that. Tell us a little bit about that and give our listeners, some that may be facing a terminal illness themselves or have a friend that's facing terminal illness, tell me how you're able to deal with that in a positive way.
I've been dealing with cancer for like the past 4 years, and 2 of those years have been stage 4. So I went to the traditional treatments of radiation and hormone deprivation therapy. And everyone at the time thought that I was cured. But when I stopped the hormone deprivation therapy, it's prostate cancer, so the PSA rose, and then scans revealed that the cancer had spread. And in the case of prostate cancer, then once it spreads, it's considered stage 4. It's all they had to offer was what they call palliative care, which I didn't want to go back on the hormone deprivation therapy because that made me feel like shit. And
Right.
my point was like, okay, you're telling me that on these therapies, which make you feel horrible, generally people live 3 to 5 years, I was kind of like, I want quality time, not, I'm not looking for quantity. And I want to feel good enough to do all the things I want to do or try and do as much as I can. And so I opted to not go along with their program. And, for the past 2 years, I've been sort of pursuing, alternative sort of methods. A friend of mine had breast cancer. She had really good luck at a clinic in Switzerland. So we went to Switzerland, which ended up not working for me. I've tried some other protocols that didn't work. But then in 2023, I was introduced to a man who was funding a new cancer cure. But at the time, the cancer wasn't big enough. They needed a tumor that was big enough to inject. So then 2024 came around and did become worse, and the tumors were bigger. But finally, there was one that was big enough to inject. And so I started this treatment at Johns Hopkins in January, and looking good. And what's happening so far is that the cancer in my neck has shrunk by 60%. There's been no progression of the cancer in my chest or in my bones. And so, something is happening, and this is sort of unheard of. And, you have to remain hopeful, and you have to really sort of look at it on a day-to-day basis. Every morning I wake up and give thanks for another day, because every day is a blessing. And I think whether we have a terminal diagnosis or not, it's like, I think that should be the approach to life anyway. We tend to sometimes forget to savor more moments, and that's all we have. So I think that, just kind of like, listen, I understand you can, I've had my moments, and whenever I've tried these experimental treatments, and then you get the blood work and the test results aren't good. I think that I allowed myself to have that moment of being disappointed and sad and everything else. But I kind of like allowed myself a day, and that was enough, because, I realized that my time is so precious. I don't want to spend it being dreary and depressed. And it was important to sort of be upbeat. And, for the past 2 years since I've been diagnosed, I've been seeing friends, I've been traveling the world, I've been working. And somehow, I have not been in any pain or discomfort or anything else. So, maybe in some ways not listening to my doctor in this case was a good thing, because I've actually felt pretty good. And now it seems that this treatment might be working. So I'm very hopeful that, I might be around a little longer than I thought.
And I can relate a lot to that. As many of my listeners know, I had open heart surgery a year ago, but I ended up having to go back in, and they put me on a ventilator because I had sepsis and pneumonia. And so when I woke up, I thought, oh my God, this is it. And so I thought, this is a time for me to embrace the moment. I'm at the best place in the world, which is Cleveland Clinic, #1 in the world for open heart surgery. And it gave me a sense of peace. And of course, I have a partner my partner John totally supported me. And I think that's a correlation between what you said. And when you go through something like that, you start appreciating the little things that you didn't notice so much before. We don't know whether we'll be here tomorrow or the next day or not. But what we do know is we're here for today. And I think when we enjoy every day and we're comfortable with who we are every day, I think we're more kinder, more softer, and more accepting of people. That's my thought on that as well. Is there anything you would like to share to our listeners as a final thought?
Yeah, I'd say that, that things always get better. And I think sometimes, especially for young people that happen to maybe sort of stuck in a situation where they're at home and they can't start their own lives yet. It's just a matter of trying to, sit tight and to know that, in time, they will be able to sort of, live the lives that they dream of living. It's just important to have a plan, I think, because, I've heard of too many stories of, children being kicked out of homes and, being practically homeless because they didn't have a place to go and that type of thing. So to sort of like, if one wants to leave this cult, they might want to get out sooner rather than later, but they may be trapped, but that situation is temporary, and most bad situations in life are temporary. Yeah, like even sort of dealing with a terminal illness, I think one can choose to be depressed and sad, or one can choose to live and be happy, while you can.
We appreciate you so much being on my podcast. You've been a gift to me. I'm sure you'll be a gift to many of our listeners as well.
It's been a great pleasure to share this time with you, and Thank you.
And best wishes for your health in the near future.
Thank you. I'm very hopeful.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
My great pleasure.
Thank you, James. Take care.